Greg took you through the storm last week, and it says we're in chapter 28, 1 through 10. So 10 verses, but there's a lot here, so we should be all right. A few times I had 2 verses, so this is good. So
sometimes you had 2 chapters.
2 chapters, yeah. But that's the way that when you break it down by events, it kind of plays out that way. So let's catch up. Where was Paul headed from in this place, and where did he come from? Headed to Rome. How come? Anybody remember? He appealed to Caesar as his right as a Roman citizen, and he's headed to Rome. Who told him he'd be going to Rome? Spirit, said, hey, don't fear right now because you're going to stand before Caesar, but not Caesar, but basically you'd be going to Rome. I don't think he said Caesar. He might have said, I lost track of that part. But so here he is. He's on his way to Rome, and the storm Greg talked about last week. They were on a boat, pretty big boat if you think about it. Had over 200 some people. We'll get to that in a minute, and cargo. So it had to be a pretty big boat. But here's the way it starts out. I'm going to read the whole 10 verses, and then we'll come back and look at it, break it apart. I think that's the best way to get the context. Once safely ashore, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The local people showed us extraordinary kindness. They lit a fire and took us all in, since it was raining and cold. As Paul gathered a bundle of brushwood and put it on the fire, a viper came out from the heat and fastened itself on his hand. When the local people saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "This man no doubt is a murderer, even though he has escaped the sea. Justice has not allowed him to live." But he shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no harm. They expected he would begin to swell up or suddenly drop dead. After that, they waited a long time and saw nothing unusual happen to him. They changed their minds and said he was a god. Now in the area around that place was an estate belonging to the leading man of the island named Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. Publius' father was in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went to him and praying and laying his hands on him and healed him. After this, the rest of those on the island who had diseases came and were healed. So they heaped many honors on us, and when we sailed, they gave us what we needed. So it's just a short little story, a short little break in the action on the way to Rome. It says that once safely ashore. I want you to think about something. How long have these guys been thrown about on the sea? How long did this storm last? Anybody pick it up in this text? Yes, sir.
I think it was like the whole day. No, almost like the whole night. I remember when the next day after the shipwreck.
The shipwrecked. If you look at the text closely, it says the 14th night they were still in the storm. Well, how many days would that be?
2 weeks.
Whew. Can you imagine? Boom, 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 boom. Tossed. I mean, anybody been on a ship tossed at sea? Everybody. Even in a boat when you're fishing or sea fishing or something. What's that feel like?
Scary. We went deep sea fishing overnight and had 30-foot waves. I mean, the water would disappear, and then all of a sudden you see everything. It's like everybody growing up stressed.
Oh man, can't imagine. Now take that for 14 days.
So you're not eating out of things.
Yeah. And it says once safely ashore. Whew. Okay. Yeah. Can you imagine? But what's Paul's expectation of where he's supposed to be? Where's he supposed to be? He's supposed to be in Rome, right? The Lord told me I was going to be in Rome. What am I doing this island? Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute, kind of how that might apply to us. But here he is, finds himself. How's that go? The ship set ground on the shore of this enchanted desert island. No, that's kind of doesn't relate because it's not really a uncharted isle, but it was someplace where ships often would stop, but they would stop on the other side of the islands, as I understand it from reading. So they're on the back side of this island, and it says we learned the island was called Malta. Malta was 60 miles from Sicily and 180 miles from Africa. That's in the middle of nowhere, right? In the ocean. The island is 18 miles long and 8 miles wide. 18 miles from close to here to Middletown, a little further than that. And then you got 8 miles wide. That's not too big a chunk of land, is it? The name actually means refuge. So if you can kind of get your mind around this, they're coming up out of this storm, out of this long, drawn-out 14-day terror, and these natives come up and say, I'd say natives, we're going to talk about that in a minute. They weren't natives as we think about natives. But these people came up from the island and said, welcome to refuge. How would you feel about that? Welcome to refuge, basically, is the name of what Malta means. The islanders, who has a King James version? Anybody have one? What's that say in King James? Anybody know? It doesn't say islanders, it says barbarians. Now, when you think about barbarians, what do you think about? Thieves, ruffians. Yeah, they don't have any morals, don't have any, we think that's what we think of when we think about barbarians. That's kind of
they didn't speak Greek. They didn't speak Greek.
That's where we're going, Greg. Yeah. The actual meaning of this term was that they didn't speak Greek. It didn't mean they were ruffians or they were uncultured or going to chop their heads off or anything like that. When we think about barbarians, we think that way. So that kind of gave an inaccurate picture. So when I used to read this story, I think, oh man, they're all these people that don't have any culture and they're coming up to him. But that wasn't the case, as Greg pointed out. It just means they didn't speak Greek. They said they showed us an unusual kindness. What would be unusual about kindness being shown to them?
Well, we had 235 people show up here saying we need shelter and food, and I think it'd be unusual.
Ooh, can you imagine? I mean, if 230-something people showed up here, say they had an accident on the freeway, we had to take care of 200. Man, somebody had to be running around doing something. But here's the kind of the case that might have made it feel unusual. Typically, there were pirates who would look for shipwrecks. What do you think they would do when they found a shipwreck? They would loot the ship, take anything they could that was left of the cargo. They would take the people captive that were usable. Otherwise, dispatch it. So they're thinking, we got out of this storm. Now we're on this island. We don't know anybody, but they're being unusually kind. That's what they're kind of. If that helps you kind of get the picture of their story. It says they built a fire and welcomed all of us because it was raining and cold. It's probably about 50 degrees in that climate. That's the estimates I read in some of the commentaries. But if you can think about being wet, tossed at sea, stressed out, and then it starts raining, probably a cold rain. And then they built a fire for them because it was raining and cold. And Paul, it says, gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. How many of you guys, what do you guys think of snakes? Anybody got a pet snake? I know some people like them. Our grandmother, she'd see a snake, she'd get a hoe or something. It was a gone snake. I remember one time she ran a lawnmower over one, I think, if I remember right. Dead snake. That's what she always said. But when you think about snakes, it's kind of universally for most people, not always. But Paul gathered about a pile of brushwood. I don't know about you. I find that interesting. William Barclay, in one of the commentaries I read, said this: Paul was a man who could not bear doing nothing. There was a bonfire to be kept alight, and Paul was gathering brushwood for it. Can you imagine? Anybody identify with that? Are you somebody that likes to sit around doing nothing while everybody's working? That bothers me. Sometimes I can't do what I used to do, and that bothers me still. But J.W. McGarvey, I found a quote by him, said Paul was not a preacher after the style of a modern clergyman, who is particularly not to soil his hands with menial labor, and who expects everybody to be ready to serve him, while he preserves his dignity and looks on. In other words, Paul's not somebody to sit around and let everybody do work. He's pitching in. You think he was as cold and as uncomfortable as everybody else? Yeah. Now reflect on that with Paul. What would be motivating Paul to be that kind of a servant? Just think about it a minute.
Well, he was a leader, and he was humble enough to do the menial work, which every Christian should be that way. Pitch in what needs to be done. It's usually a leader that either sees it's done or he's doing it himself. He was willing to do the menial task.
Who else was like that? Yeah. What was the whole washing the feet thing about? What did he say about it?
Servitude.
Do this for one another. Because I've done it for you. Paul here is being an example. I think we kind of fly over this, but I think he's being an example to us about what we need to be about as far as servants. Philippians 2:1 says, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any fellowship with the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and purpose. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourself. So we're told as Paul was placing this firewood or this wood on the fire, it would appear, I don't know, about 50 degrees, snakes aren't very active, in my experience. But getting near the fire, warming this brush up, the snake attaches to his hand and is dangling there. That picture kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies. I don't know about you guys, but it's dangling there. What's the significance of that?
Well, a viper is a poisonous snake. If you got one hanging off your hand, you just been bit by a poisonous snake.
What's he hanging by?
His fangs.
His fangs.
Don't put the fluid in it.
Yeah, and there's a reason I'm bringing that up. There are people that say that wasn't a poisonous snake. It was not, and they try to do away with the miracles of the Bible. Y'all know the people that try to do that. It wasn't. They just thought it was a poisonous snake. First of all, the people that lived there would have recognized what kind of snake it was because they avoid them all the time. And secondly, he's hanging there by his fangs. He's not gumming his finger, and so he was injected with venom. Does that make sense? Yeah, that kind of. I say, why do you gotta work so hard to get around the truth for? Anyway, that's the reason I brought that up. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer, for though he escaped the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. When you hear the word justice in this text, what do you think about it? What does it bring to your mind?
The fates are.
Go ahead.
Criminal.
Maybe he was a criminal getting his just due. Is kind of what they're saying, right? Yeah. But yeah, Greg getting ready to point out the thing that might think a little. Go ahead, Greg.
The fates, karma. You got away from the sea, but it's going to get you.
Yeah.
Because you have been a bad person.
Yeah, and that's the philosophy that went along with their culture. It's not the concept of justice that we think about, but probably more than likely, if you look in your text, is it capitalized? More than likely, it's the deity of justice that they serve. The Greek stories there's a Greek story about a viper biting a man who was guilty in a similar manner. And I can't remember the name or the details of that story. I read it, but I can't remember all the details. And there's a Greek goddess called Dike, D-I-K-E, or Nemesis is another term for that Greek goddess of justice. And so more than likely, they're saying our God is taking care of him because he was not. Is that making sense to everybody more than just the concept of justice? The concept of justice fits, but if you think about it from their perspective, it's more than likely one of these two. But it says, but Paul shook the snake off in the fire and suffered no ill effects. Just flip it in there. Now, who's writing this account by all our understanding? Luke. He says it, claims it, right?
Luke's the physician.
The physician, the doctor. So what do you think? What do you think Luke thinks about this poisonous viper being flung off into the fire? What do you think he's waiting for with Paul? He's probably running to get his medical bag. I don't know if he carried a medical bag, but he's getting ready to do something. But suffered no ill will. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead, but after waiting a long time, seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. So when a venomous snake bites a person, it breaks down, I don't know if you're familiar with this, it breaks down the capillaries and causes internal hemorrhaging, bleeding inside. The place swells up, and typically the person would die fairly quickly without intervention. With modern medicine, we have counteractants and that type of thing that they wouldn't have had here. But basically, in this time and day and time, if you got bit by a poisonous snake, it was history. Okay, it was kind of like curtains over, curtains down, story over. An interesting thing. Somebody look up Luke 10:19. Roger, you get that for me?
Can you imagine the emotion?
Yeah.
Because it's different from everybody's point of view.
Yeah.
People on the ship, then he's the one that says, you're going to listen, we're going to be right, I'm worried about it. And then he gets off ship, starts firing, and all of a sudden they're thinking, he's the one that comes here and
we're going there in a minute, Steve. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. We're going there in a minute. That's kind of my application part of this. So the Luke 10:19 and Mark 16:7. Go ahead and get that, Roger, if you don't mind.
Luke 10:19. I have given authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and to overcome the power of the enemy. Nothing will harm you.
That was when Jesus sent out the was it 60 or 70? It's either one of those groups. And then in Mark 16, Kyle just had this in his class last week that he did. Go into all the world, preach the gospel to all creation. Whoever believes and baptized will be saved. Whoever does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name, they will drive out demons. They'll speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes. If they should drink anything deadly, it will not harm them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will get well. So these were signs that were to accompany the apostles, right? This is the only occasion that we find that fulfilled with the snake situation. Now I got to tell you, you bring a snake in here, yeah, and I don't think it had anything to do with my faith. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it was a sign of his apostleship. Also, I forgot about 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians 12. 10 to 12. So I take pleasure in weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, difficulties for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I've been a fool for you, forced on me. You ought to have commended me, since I am not in the way inferior to those super apostles, even though I'm nothing. The signs of an apostle were performed with unfailing endurance among you, including signs and wonders and miracles. So why did Paul need extra signs and wonders to confirm his position? Kind of go back a few chapters that we discussed. I think Greg had that lesson about Paul's credentials. Why did Paul need signs and wonders, maybe more than others? Because of his previous life, his the way he used to mistreat Christians, that was very important. Anybody other thoughts?
So not always gave a miracle or a message. Mm-hmm. They're more receptive to believe the message. That's what's important about a miracle.
Yeah.
And all the circumstances in life.
Yeah, we've kind of blown them up out of proportion from what they were, but they were there for a reason. These natives, like Steve's talking about a minute ago, these natives see this poisonous viper, and they we'll come to more of what you're talking about in a minute, but they have all these signs that this guy is something different. Okay, when you have somebody different, you know it, right? You know that guy's worth listening to. Okay, so good point.
Mike?
Yes, sir.
Paul would need these signs more so than the other apostles because he wasn't part of the original crew.
Yes, right. I remember you talking about that, Greg, because he wasn't in the chosen ones. So he has to have these extra demonstrations. Now I don't know with these people. I don't know if that's been true, especially, but he needs those signs to show who he was. But here's the thing that I find really interesting, and back to what Steve was saying again, they flip from he's like a demon to what? He's a god. Okay, how do you go from this guy's cursed by God and he is a god? I mean, just when you think about that, what do you think about?
Well, they were paganistic as far as the belief, because they worship gods in plural and honest justice. And that's unusual. It's what the Greeks did, basically.
Yeah.
Historically.
Yeah.
Most all the Greek Empire that he went to.
When we think about that, let's come back to that in a minute. But yeah, when we think about it, I just want you to think about it. What's that? How do you go from he's a demon to he's a god? And I want you to think about too, before we're going to have some discussion toward the end. When you think about this fickleness of these people, do we ever find ourselves doing that kind of thing? Just think about it. Just maybe, I don't know. We'll see. McGarvey talked about in one of the commentaries, he called this Listia reversed. Anybody remember what happened in Listia in Acts 14? What they start off? They started
off with Paul and was it Barnabas or Silas at this point? And they were gods.
Yeah, they were.
But But when they made the point, we're not gods, they stoned them.
Yeah, they switched really quickly.
Yeah.
And so, and remember what Paul said when they started to worship him? Greg, we're not gods. We're just men. And so you got this flip-flop, you know, I don't know. Flip-flops are interesting to think about. But we'll get to that in a minute in the discussion. By the way, the snake handling deal, you know, there's people in parts of the nation that do that with snakes and that kind of thing. Like I said earlier, I ain't doing it. Matthew 4:7 talks about do not put the Lord your God to the test. That was Christ speaking that. 1 Corinthians 3:16. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and God's Spirit lives in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is sacred and you are that temple. So, you know, to me, that's more like testing God. If God, you know, like you said, there's miracles had a purpose. If God had a purpose for me to be bitten by a snake and live, I'm fine with that. But I ain't sticking my hand in no box of snakes. I'm sorry. If y'all think different than that, you have to convince me pretty hard. But anyway, just as a side for that, the text continues that there was an estate nearby. It's kind of interesting to think about who this guy was. It says there was on this island there was an estate nearby, maybe on the other side of the island. Who's gone to Honduras in here? What are there parts of Honduras that are different than others? What's the difference?
Well, you know, the poorest are poor, and then you know the rich, and there's no other side.
Like one side of the island is one way, one side, you know, it's. I'm thinking maybe this is the way that was. I'm not sure. I can't say for sure, but you know, like Linda's saying, when you go to Honduras, you see these people that are enjoying a resort on one end of the island, and in the mountains, there's like they only have a house, and so they're building houses. Huh? Living in cardboard boxes, and your people are building houses for them, which it's cool. But I'm thinking maybe that's the same way on this island. That somewhere on this island, there's typically Rome, when they captured or they took over a portion, and they occupied this island at this time. They would leave somebody procure, anyway, somebody in charge of the place, and they would stay there and live there. So this is like the governor, or however you want to put it, of the island, or whatever. He's in charge of things. Kind of the way I take it. I may be off on that, but it's likely a Roman official overseeing the island. But he welcomed us in his home for 3 days and entertained us hospitably. Now, how many people were there? Say it again, Linda.
276.
Woo! That'd be a big party, wouldn't it? Yeah. There's, huh?
You had a big house.
Yeah, either you had a big house or not everybody went. Maybe just Paul and some other people went. But for somehow, if there was that many people, that's a bunch. But maybe just Paul and his entourage. But if it was everybody, it was a bunch. But for 3 days, they were in his place. What happened for the next? Now, bear with me a minute and think a minute. How long were they on this island? Who said that? 3 months. So where did they go the rest of the time? Maybe camping. You know, we're not told specifically. If the islanders were so hospitable, maybe they took them in their homes. You know, we're not told specifically. But for 3 months, they're on this island and people are taking care of them. I think it's pretty impressive for folks to be in that kind of a mindset. But it says this fellow's father was sick and in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. It's probably, in the commentary that I read said it was probably Malta fever. In 1887, this disease was discovered that can persist for like 3 years, caused by a microorganism in goat's milk. And it's called now they call it brucellosis or something like that. I'm sorry, Bruce, nothing to do with you. Brucellosis or something like that. And it causes chills, fevers, weight loss, joint muscle pain, enlarged spleen, and possibly encephalitis. And they found they have a cure for it now. But then if this is what this was, this is serious business. And probably this man wasn't the only one suffering from it. Paul goes in to see him, and after prayer, we're told he places his hand on him and healed him. Now, when one of the apostles healed people, what did they typically say, or how did they go about that? Is there anything they typically said that you can remember?
Place their hands on, pray over them in the name of Jesus.
In the name of Jesus of Nazareth, typically that's what we see. So we're not told that here, but more than likely, I can't imagine Paul not doing that. When this had happened, the rest of the sick in the island came to him and were cured. Do you remember another time when people were healed and a bunch of people came out of the woodwork to be healed? Remember another time in Scripture? Remember when Peter's mother was healed? Who healed Peter's mother? Jesus. Yeah, right. Was it Jesus?
Yeah.
And what happened after that? Multitudes came, okay? It's in Mark 1, 32 through 34, and Luke 4, 40 through 40 and 41. People just flooding after that, flooding in. So it's kind of like a repeat of what happened there. People are just coming in. You've got the folks that don't want to say these are miracles, saying that Luke had something to do with it, and they were just doing medical stuff, like a medical mission. And there's some Greek terms that indicate that the first healing was different than the others. But I guess I just accept that they were just healing people, and they were just coming in droves. So here's the question that Steve brought up earlier. What do you think the people were thinking? Paul predicted the safety of the crew, nobody to be lost when they were in the storm. 14 days tossed at sea. He survived the snake. Okay? Now he has multiple healings that he's done. Now, what were you thinking earlier, Steve? You were a little bit ahead of me.
Oh, I have to all kinds of stuff.
Go ahead.
That were witnesses, the people that were on it. First of all, they survived. And it's kind of like this is incredible. He predicted it. Now they're watching, get bit. They're assuming he's dead.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, yeah, he's going to die.
He's the one that saved all us. Yeah.
Now, the people from the island were different. They're like, wow, he survived. That's what we did. Oh, he survived. See, this guy, he's going to die. And then he doesn't. Just the perspective that comes from looking from outside in. And we do that. That's the same thing.
Yeah. It is. Yeah. Yeah, and that's a good. We were thinking on the same lines. Yes, sir.
The whole thing. It's not like, did he scream and yell? Oh, I'm not saying he was, or did he? I'm going to go. I'm not going to.
You already told me. Yeah.
Yeah. They're probably freaking out. Why did he walk?
Yeah. My mind went the same way. Yeah, I think that's very, very good. But you would think that these people were like, especially the people that are on the boat with him. The servants or the slaves that did the ship and the soldiers. Can you imagine the soldier in charge of him? What are you thinking about? I ain't touching this guy. This is where my mind went. It's interesting, people talk about healing today. I think God heals today, but I don't think he does it miraculously through people like in Paul here. What's interesting is in Philippians, I'm just going to read these save time because we won't have discussion time. Philippians 2:25 says, "But I think it necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker, and fellow soldier, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. For he longs for all of you and is in distress because you heard he was ill. Indeed, he was ill and almost died, but God had mercy on him. And now, not only him, but also me, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore, I'm all the more eager to send him so that when you see him again, you'll be glad and may have less anxiety. Welcoming in the Lord and honor him like men, because he almost died for the work of Christ, risking his life to make up for the help you could not give me." So the question is, this is like a couple of years later, how come Paul didn't heal him? Okay. In 2 Timothy 4:19, greet Priscilla, Aquila, the household of Onesimus. Erastus stayed in Corinth. I left Trophimus sick in Miletus. Left him sick in wait a minute, Paul could heal. Why did he leave him sick? So, like, back to what Bruce was saying, these miracles had purpose and reason. They weren't just random. And so, so in other settings, Paul doesn't do the miracles that he did here. So I think it kind of makes us wake up to the idea of somebody doing. I mean, if God wants to break that out, I'm fine. I mean, he can do a lot of good work, but I don't buy into it in a lot of ways today. That's my view on that. The way they ended this is kind of abrupt ending to this story. In verse 10, they honored us in many ways, and when they were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies we needed. So not only did they take care of them, but they supplied them when they left. These are kind people, good folks. What do you notice glaringly missing in this story?
It doesn't say anything about Paul preaching to them and converting them or what I suspect.
There's nothing said about preaching, teaching, nothing said about anybody being converted. And like Roger said, I think probably they did, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But nothing said about that. All the rest of the stories we read in Acts, can you think of another story? There's nothing. Paul preached till midnight, or Paul, taught them about Jesus, or none of that's mentioned in this passage, which is a little bit odd. One of my thoughts goes to, who's writing this again? What's he interested in? The healings and maybe that wasn't. Maybe the preaching thing didn't fit his purpose, and he didn't mention it. We're not told, but there's not any mention about. Now here's what's interesting. Let me share this with you, and it kind of backs up what Roger's saying here. This is from a history of Malta that I got off of their. It's not Bible, so just don't take it as gospel. Time passed during the Roman times, exactly 60 A.D., when St. Paul was shipwrecked on the islands, changing Malta's religious history forever. Even if there's no direct evidence, it's said that St. Paul performed several miracles, among which was the healing of the governor's father, Publius. St. Paul converted Publius to Christianity, who later on became the first bishop of Malta. By the 3rd century A.D., almost all the inhabitants of Malta were Christians. The signs of an early Christian community can be seen in the catacombs in Rabat. So according to Christian tradition outside of the biblical record, there were some pretty important things that happened in Malta. Now you can take that for what you want, but I think it's pretty. I agree with Roger. I can't imagine Paul not preaching, not teaching. And sometimes you can preach and teach without saying a word. So maybe that was the situation.
They're so ingrained in idolatry that maybe later
maybe they weren't ready for it yet. Yeah, maybe this started an influence.
they called him God and they worship God. So
Yeah.
It was a transition, I'm sure, but I believe people say.
I agree with you. But I think it's just interesting to think about that nothing was said about it. So here's back to another question we had earlier. So what do you think about this fickleness of the people? Are we ever fickle with things? In faith? Dr. Conver, one of my mentors and person I really respect, he always said, when you smell the fires of worship, beware, somebody's about to be burned. What he meant by that, when you get a lot of praise from people, watch your back door, because somebody's getting ready to be burned. Okay, people are fickle. We're fickle. We'll be happy with this and not happy with that. You know, you're the greatest since sliced bread, and no, you're not. You know, it's interesting. It's just, I guess, it's human, but somehow we got to get past that. How difficult would it have been? I got one more question after this. How difficult would it have been to leave this Malta and go to Rome? Like Steve said, he was excited about going to Rome. But just in general, knowing probably what was coming, wouldn't it be kind of nice just to lay back a little bit in Malta and hang out with I can't say his name right, Publius in the castle? I mean, so it's interesting to think about these things in my mind. My mind's different though. So here's I think the most important question about this text. Do we face times like Paul when our life seems sidetracked from where we thought we were headed? You think you're going such and such way, you think you're doing such and such time, and you get sidetracked? What's that like for you?
It can be a faith breaker or a faith maker.
Yeah, it can be rough sometimes, but it can also I'm trying to remember. There's a Chinese word for crisis that means a difficult time, and it also means an opportunity. It's both. It's a difficult time to go through, but it's also an opportunity. And Paul just goes on, takes the opportunity, gets bit by the snake, flips it in the fire, and goes to Rome. You know, that's a pretty good example for us.
God brings the sunshine, he also brings the rain.
Yeah, I think of Romans 8:28, God works together for good for all those who love the Lord. Now, when you think about that passage, I think about it differently. I don't think God orchestrates all these things. I think he works through them to bring us where we need to be. You know, I think a little differently than some people than that, but I think that he can work through all the things that get thrown at us and bring us to where he wants us to be. Well, thank you for your.
He didn't say he changed purpose.
No, he didn't.
He wants to shine through.
And he'll work through them with you. Yes, sir. Walk through it with you. Yep, very good.
He brings the increase.
Yep. Turns it into something beautiful. Well, thanks for online people for being with us, and thanks for being here, everybody. Y'all have a good worship.